Welcome to CivilNet. In our continuing effort to try to understand what has happened in Istanbul throughout Turkey over the construction proposed in Gezi Park, we will speak today with Professor Heghnar Watenpaugh, who is at the University of California, Davis, and is a historian of the art and architecture of the Middle East. Heghnar, thank you for joining us on CivilNet.
Thank you for having me, Salpi.
Heghnar, you have a very interesting mix of skill sets, knowledge bases. You've lived in Istanbul, you're an Armenian from the Middle East, you're a historian of art and architecture, and it's as if this Gezi Park outburst, it's not even an incident anymore, huh? This episode in the development of the Republic of Turkey includes all of those specializations of yours. It includes the Armenian angle, it includes the whole Middle Eastern development, and it's certainly about architecture, urban planning, all of that, no?
Absolutely. It's also about the historical resonance of key urban sites. It's about spatial memory. So for me, it's been really wonderful, even though it's not wonderful to see the violence against the protesters. But as an architectural historian, I feel vindicated in that architectural history, spatial memory, these things are really central to the way citizens feel about their city, as we're seeing in Istanbul and other cities in Turkey. And also the control over urban space, control over access to the resources that urban space presents is a very important component of state power.
Let's talk about spatial memory. What does that mean?
Spatial memory is a concept that refers to the way urban residents feel about special places in their city. Taksim Square and that entire area is a symbol of modern Istanbul. Over the course of the 20th century, it's been a very important social space for a variety of reasons. From the most prosaic, it's a transportation hub. It's a place you go to take your bus to somewhere else.
It's easy.
So it's very central to the way you would move around the city as a citizen of Istanbul. But it's also a space that has a very special resonance to Istanbulus because of the fact that it has been a key space for social protests. In recent years, April 24 commemorations of the Armenian genocide that have recently begun to take place in various parts of Turkey have taken place in Taksim Square.
And that's a perfect example of the variety of kinds of causes that find Taksim Square to be their platform.
Absolutely. And also a lot of opposition groups, a lot of militant groups. It was considered significant that May 1 Workers' Day demonstrations took place again this year in Taksim Square. In the past, it has been a place where protesters of various kinds and the government forces have clashed. So it's a space that's very rich in memories and meaning
for many
from the
people.
Most prosaic, for many people in Istanbul, from the most prosaic, from the most everyday to the most politically loaded.
And Gezi Park is also very symbolic for Istanbulites.
Yes, for many reasons. Gezi Park is today one of the last remaining open green spaces in Istanbul. As you know very well, Salpi, Istanbul is an enormous city today. It's a world city. It's sprawling, it's enormous, and there are very few open spaces. So Gezi Park is one of those remaining spaces, and it was a symbol of modern Istanbul because that entire area was designed in the 1940s by Istanbul municipality through the French urban planner Henri Prost as an urban ensemble. And the municipality then, after the design of the park in the 40s, continued to create the urban ensemble that we see today with the great hotels around Taksim and Gezi Park and so on. So it's a very special type of space in Istanbul, which, as you know, is a very ancient city. It has a history of thousands of years, and there are parts of Istanbul that symbolize the deeper past of Istanbul. Gezi Park, Taksim Square symbolize the modern space. There's a wonderful monument to Atatürk, which in Taksim Square, which has been a site of protests recently.
Why is it a wonderful monument?
Yes.
Why is it wonderful?
In terms of design, it's
you got to explain, otherwise we're going to get questions.
It's a beautifully designed space, is what I meant, and it's also a space that it's a beautifully designed space that is very modern, as opposed to more historical types of architecture that you find just off of Taksim Square, what is now called Istiklal Caddesi, Independence Street, that used to be known as the Grande Rue de Pera, was a wonderful space of 19th century Istanbul, where you have landmarks for Bolsahai life, Ottoman Armenian life, such as the Tokatlian Cafe and Hotel, and so on.
You know what's
interesting?
These are the
kinds of, these are the kinds of spaces that you read about in novels by Zabel Yesayan and so on.
You know what's interesting is that on the one hand, ostensibly all of this began over the environmental value of Gezi Park. And then over the days of the protest, the other values of Gezi Park as the perhaps not so fair replacement by modern Turkish presence of the old Armenian, Greek, Jewish presence. That spatial memory that you refer to kicked in.
It kicked in. I don't know if it kicked in for all the protesters. I mean, the history of non-Muslim endowments and properties that have been taken over by the state in recent years is a history that is only now becoming better known, and steps are being taken to address injustices of the past. The Turkish parliament passed a law recently that allows non-Muslim endowments to recover some of their properties or redress the injustices of the past through the courts, and that's a process that has been ongoing very slowly, and it's very uneven, but steps are being made in that direction. The Hrant Dink Foundation has been very important in clarifying some of this history. They have an interactive website in Turkish where you can follow the various Armenian foundations in Istanbul, and you can see the various properties, where they are, and whether they are still controlled by the community or not.
And it's the best representation of what we keep calling the Armenian presence in the Ottoman Empire, in Ottoman Istanbul and Byzantium, and you don't realize the immensity of that until you really look at that work by the Hrant Dink Foundation.
Absolutely. Now, and it also has, just like everything else in urbanism, it also has an impact on the market. I mean, a lot of people have discussed the market value of the lands that around Taksim that were part of the former Sulpagop cemetery. And we're talking about one of the most valuable sections of real estate in Istanbul.
So we've digressed a bit, but okay, if we understand that this was part of cosmopolitan Istanbul, and then the agencies of state power found ways to remove some of their traditional historic owners and replace it by a public park, a public square, a transportation hub, hotels, and all of that. Okay, let's say we understand all of that. Now suddenly you have a prime minister that not only wants to continue that trend, all right, so he wants to sacrifice a few trees, but he's replacing this, on the one hand, by commercial establishments, on the other hand, with replicas of old Ottoman barracks? Where does this come from?
The creation of the space of Gezi Park, Taksim Square, the area around it, was the product of an earlier period of the history of Istanbul. What is happening today is that the AKP party, the party in power, has identified Taksim Square, the area around it, as the location of one of their grand urban transformation projects. The AKP party has been very involved in these projects, including some that Erdogan himself calls my crazy projects. They are incredibly ambitious, and they're aimed at completely transforming both the appearance and the use of really critical spaces in Istanbul. Now, the problem with this, from the point of view of protesters and many inhabitants of Istanbul and many Turkish citizens, is that these great projects have unfolded with very little consultation with people who work in the area, people who live in the area, people whose lives would be affected by these major reshapings of urban space. So they're perceived as being very heavy-handed. And this is not the first time the AKP and Erdogan himself, he himself is very interested in urban planning, have done projects like this. Several neighborhoods in Istanbul, such as Tarlabaşı, and so on, have been completely transformed in recent years.
But look, I understand that. I understand that administrations want to get, involved in urban planning. This is not just the largest city in Turkey. It's one of the, the world cities. I get all that. This is a city that has a lot of old buildings, mosques, monuments. He wants to take this modern space and put in a replica of an old Ottoman barracks. Where does that come from?
That is the historical vision of the particular kind of Islam, the vision for a modern global Turkish society that the AKP represents, where the Islamic dimension of Turkishness is at the forefront. And they express this visually, or they want to express this visually, through this notion of neo-Ottoman style, what some have called Ottoman nostalgia, nostalgia for a particular vision of the Ottoman past. But, let's be very clear, the barracks that are going to be rebuilt, they're not going to be rebuilt as they were built in the early 19th century. They're going to be rebuilt as modern buildings with all of the amenities of modern life, and the functions that are going to be housed there, at least what has been announced so far, are commercial functions related to neo-capitalism, related to the new global marketplace. And the people who are going to be the ones benefiting from these grand projects are the new middle classes that have, or upper and middle classes that have benefited from the policies of the AKP. What the protesters object to is that what used to be public space is now being turned into private space or corporate space. What used to be a space of freedom, an unpredictable space where all kinds of interesting things could happen, is now being turned into very kinds of very closely policeable areas, primarily for commercial purposes. So this is what goes to the heart of the movement. The Gezi Park movement began as a right to the city movement, people wanting to exert space over the public, the beloved public spaces of their own city.
You couldn't say it better for a conclusion. I think that that's what we're going to be watching, is that the people who stood up want a say over their city's development. It's that simple. When the American politician said all politics are local, he wasn't kidding. This is really a local expression of a global need.
I agree.
Thank you very much for a fascinating description of the many layers of what's been going on in Gezi Park and Taksim and Istanbul and Turkey, and we do hope to invite you back.
Thank you very much, Salpi.
Thank you. We've been speaking with Professor Heghnar Watenpaugh, who is a historian of the art and architecture of the Middle East, which is exactly what we needed today as we continue to try to understand that which took place over the last several weeks in Istanbul. Thank you for following us on CivilNet.